welcome. For those of you in the back rows, I mentioned earlier this isn't church now, so we want you to move up. I'm not mic'd up for broadcasting, so if you can't hear me, I'll try to speak up, but feel free to move up. See if this is working. Okay, yes. Okay, I've lived in Big Sandy. I bring you greetings from Big Sandy. We are a third generation wheat and cattle operation. We've been organic for over 30 years. My grandfather started the place in 1920. We have a 9-year crop rotations, and we're having some fun with cover crops too, although we're not near as far along as Gabe is, but we have a lot of fun. I'll just give you a few examples of some of the things that we grow. For those of you that, where's the pointer on this? Oh, there it is. Big Sandy's right up here. Those of you who don't know where Big Sandy is, it's north central Montana. Here's the triangle, Golden Triangle area where the big wheat country is, and we're on the eastern border of that. We're just a couple miles from the Missouri River breaks and a couple miles from the Bear Paw Mountains. We grow crops, some of them are a little more unusual than others. Buckwheat is one. It's not too common. We're growing Indian corn on a small acreage. We're growing dryland vegetables, showing that we can grow lots of things without irrigation, corn. We have a lot of luck with potatoes and with squash. Here's some of our squash, a winter squash and summer squash. I was surprised that we could grow summer squash. I just didn't experimenting kind of one thing after another. We have a small orchard. This is some of our apples in the orchard. We grow sour cherries. We can't grow sweet cherries yet, but I'll show you something we can grow. These are peaches. This tree survived 3 winters and 4 summers, and we had about 50 peaches the last year that was in operation. My wife was always saying to me, "What are you doing all this, planting all these trees for?" He says, "So much work." And I brought in one of these peaches. I let them fall to the ground, and I put about this much straw around the peach tree, and I let the peach drop overripe onto the straw, and I brought it to my wife, and she said, "Why did you only plant one of these?" So anyway, we have a lot of fun with that. This is a watermelon that we grew a few years back. When I was a kid, I planted watermelons every year. I never got anything bigger than a softball, and most of the time it never got ripe. It wasn't any good. This is the next year. It's my dad and my son cutting a 30-pound. Well, this one's 23 pounds. The one year before was 30 pounds. A watermelon. So I tell my friends, guys, don't worry. This global warming, it's not so bad. But anyway, it just gets when people ask me what I know about climate change, I say, well, I really don't know too much, but let me show you where I live, and then I show you my peach tree and my watermelon, and you can make your own judgments. So I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about growing your own fuel. And so I want you to realize, and first of all, I have many twists and turns in my story, and so it's just like real life. There's really no direct path to success. And the key, I think, is just don't give up. When you hit a brick wall or you hit a blind alley, just backtrack and go over it and try something else until it works. My goal was, starting out, was to grow my own fuel. My plan in 2008, almost 10 years ago, was started with camelina. I bought a Chinese press for $2,000 because I didn't have $18,000 to buy a German one, a nice one. But I was told this Chinese press would work, and by a very good friend, and I bought it from him. And I started out with the idea to make biodiesel. So I was going to use camelina, which I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. It's a brassica. It can be planted really early in cold soils in March, in early March. It blooms and sets seed before the heat hits. So for us, it's a lot more viable than canola, which normally blooms when the heat's on and the heat is destroying the flowers. And I was going to take that camelina, crush it, and then I had a homemade biofuel digester that I was going to turn that into biodiesel. So what happened to Plan A? Well, first of all, the Chinese press is a disaster. I couldn't get it to work. I invited all my friends over who are the greatest mechanics in the county, and they spent a half a day, and at the end of the half a day we had a gallon of oil. It smelled like coffee because it was so burnt, and it plugged up and had to be taken apart many times. All the directions were in Chinese. Even the pictures were in Chinese. I figured it was Chinese because it didn't look like what was in front of me, you see. So after one season, I gave that back to the guy that I bought it from, and he actually sent me a check, which I appreciate very much. And so I got my money back from that. And then I kind of bit the bullet, and I wrote out a bigger check, a lot bigger check, and bought a German press that my son, who was about 14 at the time, he could run. So that was a big difference in the technology. The biodiesel, even before I tried it, I was discouraged about all the parameters that had to go in with making biodiesel. You have to use lye, you have to use an alcohol of some kind to esterify the oil to break it down into biodiesel. And then you have to wash it and make sure that all the compounds are out. And then you have this wash water you have to dispose of. And then you have glycerin as a byproduct you have to do something with. And I got thinking, I don't know if I want to do all that. And then you have to test the end product to make sure that the reaction has gone correctly. And the test to know that the fuel is really good is quite expensive. And when you're doing small volumes, it really wasn't economical to do that. So I started looking around for alternatives, and I was told, well, first of all, before I get to the next one, I was told that SVO by all the people doing seminars at the time was not possible, that you couldn't use straight vegetable oil to run in a diesel engine. And then I had a friend, actually Josh Lotnick, many of you maybe know him from Missoula, runs the Peace Fund there. He said, well, I know of a company in Germany called Elsbed, and they produce a adaptation for their engines that you can actually run a straight vegetable oil with. So in my trips overseas, I go to Europe 3 or 4 or 5 times a year, in Germany at least once or twice. And I went to visit the Elsbed company, and they said, oh, sure, you can do this, and showed me how to do it. But you can't use camelina, because camelina is high in omega-3s. It's a polyunsaturated fatty acid, and you have to use a monounsaturated fatty acid, which means fatty acids with only one double bond, and to use for straight vegetable oil. Safflower, high oleic safflower, is just such a plant, and so I started looking at high oleic safflower. This is our German presses. I wish I had a picture of the Chinese one. It's quite a bit different. This is the modification we had to make on our Caterpillar tractor. We had to add a tank for diesel fuel to start the engine to get it heated up, and then once it was heated up, this heat exchanger, which I'll give you a little closer look at, it heats up the vegetable oil, and when it reaches a certain temperature, it automatically switches the vegetable oil into the injectors, and you're running on vegetable oil. You can't feel any difference in power. You can't hear anything. Nothing is different except for the smell of the exhaust, and then it smells like French fries instead of diesel, which is quite a little bit more pleasant. And the back tank we fill with the vegetable oil, and the front tank we fill the small tank with diesel. At the end of the day, we slow down the engine and cool it down, or switch it automatically or manually, so that we're running on diesel at the end of the day to fill the lines and the filters with diesel again, so that the next day we start the engine on diesel. It's very, very difficult to start it on vegetable oil. It's too viscous, but when you heat it up to about 160 degrees, it has the same viscosity as diesel fuel at ambient temperatures. There's what the field looks like of safflower. It's particularly good for our area because it loves heat, and it has a huge taproot, and it goes looking for water, so it works well for us. But we also discovered the safflower can be used and sold to restaurants for about $2 a pound. For those who can do this math in their head, and I kind of rounded off the numbers, at 8 pounds a gallon, that's about $16 a gallon. Now, let's think about that. When you look at even high-cost diesel fuel at $4, what are you going to put in your tank, folks? So I got thinking, I said, well, this doesn't make sense to put straight vegetable oil that I could sell for $2 a pound into my fuel tank, replacing diesel that it's costing a quarter of that. So, anybody see a problem with that? Well, I saw a problem with that. So anyway, went to Plan C now. So now we're on Plan C. We're going to use the oil first for food and then for fuel. So we can sell it for the $1.50 or $2 a pound for food to the restaurants. We recover the waste oil from them, and this completely ends the whole argument about food versus fuel anyway. And the best part is that, well, I'll get to that in a minute. We get to sell it twice. And when you sell your products twice, guys, you know what that does to the bottom line? That really helps. So that's really the fun part. So here's the new plan. We started out, my first idea was to rent the oil to the restaurants, and then I would keep possession of it, and then I'd just take it back. Because I have to get my own oil back to run the tractor properly, because we can't use the stuff, the cheap oil that most restaurants use with all these additives and everything. You can't put that in your diesel engine and expect it to go. You have to use monounsaturated, high quality oil. So that was the first thing. But the restaurant said rent. They said, well, how does that work? We'd rather buy it and we don't want to have the liability or the questions of this rent idea. So I never really got the first base with that. But I did make a deal with them that we would pick up the old oil as we delivered the new oil. And then I ran into an interesting situation with the state of Montana. If you pick up waste oil, as they would call it, then you are a waste handler. And the credentials for a waste handler are quite ominous. You have to sign up and get licenses and pay fees and take tests and all kinds of stuff, and have ways you're going to handle this waste, and on and on and on. But if you're buying used oil, even for, say, a penny a pound or a nickel or whatever, now you're not a waste handler anymore. You are buying something that has value. You're buying used oil. So now I'm a used oil buyer and not a waste handler picking up free oil. I pay a little bit to the restaurants, and then everybody's happy. You see how you can make the bureaucracy work sometimes? It's amazing. Then you clean the old oil, and that's pretty simple. And I'll show you what we do in that. And then, as I mentioned already, you sell it twice, and that's really nice. So how do we do this whole thing? We grow the crop, we clean the seed, we press the oil on the farm, we sell it to restaurants, and we also sell it to people who make soap, and we have some retail bottles that I'll show you in a second too, that we sell some to the retail stores. By far the biggest use is the restaurants and the soap manufacturers. Of course, the soap is a one-way trip. We don't get any oil back from that. But our two biggest customers now are Montana State University and the University of Montana. And the University of Montana was very helpful in helping us recycle and getting our used oil back. Montana State University, they're more of a engineering school, and they haven't figured this out yet. So, and I'm a Bobcat. You see, this is quite hard on me that the Grizz over here had this figured out for years, and Montana State hasn't. So, if any of you are alumni of Montana State, maybe you can help me out, because we can't let the Grizz get ahead of us this bad. But those are my two biggest customers now, and the entire campus of both of those units are being fed with our Ohio Lake sapphire oil in their kitchens. So one thing that was a surprise to us, that we thought we would be getting back about 3/4 or so of this oil that we were providing, but we're getting only about half back. But one thing that we noticed is that the life of the oil, we didn't expect this, because it's Ohio Lake and so stable, it lasts longer than these cheap oils that they're using, because they break down faster. And so more oil is going out in the food, that gives less oil actually coming back to us. So we're only getting about half the oil back from the U of M that we supply them with. In the cleaning process, we have to remove the water, and I'll show you, and then the other debris, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And then we are using that oil when we're at full capacity, and we had little problems this year with our tractor of having it work the whole time. But when things are working properly, we're using about 1,000 gallons a year, and that's about 11% of our oil use, and we're just using it on one tractor, on the Caterpillar I showed you. So here's a close-up picture of the safflower. The nice thing about this is it doesn't suffer much from deer predation, because deer don't even walk through this. In fact, you don't want to walk through it unless you have leather shafts on. It's really stickery. It's like a thistle with real barbs on it, and so not much bothers it. And if we get a good crop, we don't have trouble. It's all organic. We grow everything organic, so we don't have trouble with diseases or anything with this. It's a pretty hardy crop. So why did we choose it? Well, Jerry Bergman, I don't know how many of you know Jerry Bergman, was retired now, but he was at worked at the Ag Experiment Station in Sydney, and his goal was to develop an oil as good as olive oil. My good friend Marcio here from Italy is going to be insulted, but I just have to say it the way it is. We're in Montana. We can't grow olive trees here, so we have to do what we can do, and so we're going to take a plant that had fair oil quality and make it better. And so he did breeding on this for about 20 years, and he came up with a really superior product that is 75 to 80% oleic acid, which gives it a huge amount of stability. This is very good for your heart. It's a very healthy oil, and so we're glad to have a substitute in cooking, because a lot of the oils that they use for frying are not very healthy. And so this is a very healthy choice. It's the best oil for high temperature cooking because it's so stable and it doesn't turn into trans fats the way the cheaper oils do. We need monounsaturated, as I mentioned already, to work for straight vegetable oil engines, and there are also high oleic sunflowers and high oleic canola. If you live in regions of the country where those would be the oil seeds of choice rather than safflower. So if you're going further north from us, you would go into canola country. If you're going further east where they get more rain, you're getting into sunflower country more, or further south, you're getting more rain. Then it's more sunflowers than it is safflower. So if you're doing high oleic, it can still work. So almost any area of the country this could work in just by choosing the correct oil. We already mentioned about the cooking life was about 50 to 60% longer than the cheaper oil, but our costs are about 20 to 30% higher. So still the buyers come out ahead. They're paying more, but it's lasting so much longer, it's costing them less. So everybody wins. So that's the kind of thing that we look for. And we like it because it's something we can grow in north central Montana where we live. This is the cow barn. I used to have a lot of cattle until I started traveling, and my wife said, well, who's going to feed these cows when you're gone? And I didn't have any hired man in the winter then. We just had hired man in the summer. And I looked at her and she says, don't look at me. And so I said, okay, honey, that's fine. So we sold the cows, and then I had a cow barn that I didn't have cows for anymore. We used to milk our cows here. We had a couple of milk cows like most of the farms did when I was growing up. And I had milk cows when my daughters were growing up. That made a good excuse for them to be home right after school. That worked really well for a few years. But anyway, I got rid of all those. So now we had an empty cow barn, and I turned it into the oil barn. So that's where we put our oil presses, and that's where our manufacturing takes place. There's what the presses look like again. The safflower seed then gravity feeds into the press hoppers, and then out the middle comes the mash, which is the leftover from the press, and the oil is dripping out these little holes into this. You can barely see the gutter setup that we have that delivers the oil then to the barrel. I'll show you in a second. And then the mash goes into a hopper, which is augured into this truck, and then the truck is full, we fill a bin. When the bin's full, we call a semi, and we sell it to, most of all this is going to Organic Valley, to their dairies, organic dairies in Oregon. So that makes a good market for that. The oil goes into this 55-gallon drum, and it will fill, when everything's working right, it'll fill about 1 drum a day. So we get about 55 gallons a day from this. This is called this butter. It's coming out with the oil. It's very, very fine and kind of gritty. And I haven't got a market for this yet. So any of you entrepreneurs out there, that we're hoping we could find somebody in the cosmetic industry that would put it, sell it as a facial cleanser or something like that. Then we wouldn't have to dispose of it as as compost. But that's the only thing left that we haven't been able to market, and we're still working on that. This is the filter press. After the oil with this butter in it comes out of the presses, we have to take all the plant debris out of the oil, and we put it through this filter press, which is just run on compressed air, forces the oil through filters of cloth and paper, and that's all the processing we do. We don't decolorize it, we don't deodorize it, we don't do anything. So it's a nice, beautiful yellowish color. That the yellow is from vitamin A and lots of other vitamins and plant secondary metabolites that are in there. It also gives you great health benefits. That comes out when you buy that pale stuff that's on the shelves of your grocery store. These are the products that we're looking at. The big barrels go to the soap company. The 5-gallon carboys go to the restaurants, and then they fill the waste, don't call it waste oil, the used oil back in those carboys, and we pick those up when we deliver the new ones. And this is what the bottles look like and the soap looks like. And for those that really want to try that out, there's one in the silent auction and one in the real auction tonight that you can bid on and try out for yourself. They're the best oil. It's the best oil for popcorn, bar none. So if you like popcorn cooked in fried in oil, this is what you should try. When we get the used oil back, we put it through. This is kind of a homemade contraption. It's not rocket science. This is a hot water heater. On the top of the hot water heater is a vacuum pump. And now, for those who still remember your physics class, when you draw a vacuum down on a container of water, it's going to boil at a much lower temperature. So this water that's in the oil, there's water in there, just a minute dissolve from frozen vegetables or frozen chicken, whatever they're frying, frozen fish. Diesel engines' tolerance for water is like 0. So we can't have any water in that. Even though it's minute, we still boil it out, and it's just a few drops come out of this water heater at about 155 degrees. It will boil, and the water will come out, and then the hot oil goes into the centrifuge, which is next to it here, through this filter, and kind of a big filter in a centrifuge, and then into these small micron filters down to about 5 microns. And then from there, the oil goes into these totes, and that's where we store it, and then just put it right into the engine, or right into the fuel tank of the Caterpillar from there. Okay, so here's kind of an overview of what it looks like on our farm if we were to turn our whole farm into an oil production for our own use. Safflower yield, this is year in and year out, sometimes a little better, sometimes a little worse, and I rounded all these numbers up so you could do the math in your head if you wanted, or maybe down, but I like to round up mostly when I'm talking about yields, at least. Safflower yield is around 900 pounds an acre. 1/3 of that is extractable oil. So out of 900 pounds, you can get about 300 pounds an acre of oil. That equals just about 40 gallons. Oil is really 7.2 pounds a gallon, not 8, as I talked to you earlier. So it's pretty close to 40. We use, as an average, on 3,300 acres of cultivated land on our farm, we average about 2.7 gallons per acre for the whole farm, for all the activities, from seeding to harvest in a year. So that equals about 9,000 gallons. So to get 9,000 gallons at 40 gallons an acre, we need about 225 acres to get to 9,000, to grow 9,000 gallons of oil. That's 7% of the farm. As I mentioned, we have a 9-year rotation of 9 different crops that we are growing, and so that's still very easily done in our rotation. But as I mentioned earlier, only half of that cooking oil comes back, so we really need to double that amount to 14% the farm. That's still almost within the 9-year rotation range of not disturbing our rotations too much with the cooking, with the safflower production. When we were in horsepower days, in our area at least, we required, most farms require about 25% of the farms to produce enough hay or pasture to feed the horses that then would do the work on the farm. So actually we cut that in half, and half of that we're selling it twice. So it's really a great boon for the horse days, and it's something that's completely regenerative and renewable, and that's the other thing that we really like about it. So what's the potential? The challenges? Well, there's a few challenges. First of all, it's illegal. I mean, is there a press here? I should have asked earlier. Anyway, according to EPA, I was back in Washington. I also go to Washington a few times a year, and I was in Tester's office, and he was going to help me with this. So he contacted EPA and see if we could, where it was really fit into their purview. And they came back to me and said, well, it's completely illegal because it's not on our approved list of fuels. Even though I'm not driving any of my vehicles on the highways, it's all on farm, it's all in my field and everything. It's not an approved fuel in the United States, so it's really illegal to use it. And I said, well, okay, what do I have to do to be approved? He said, oh, well, you just have to go through the testing procedure. I said, great, how much does that cost and how long will that take? And he said, oh, well, 3 or 4 years and maybe $1 or $2 million. And I said, oh. I said, well, you got me mixed up with somebody else. I don't really have an extra couple $1 million. So he said, well, don't worry about this too much. He said, and I think this is left over from previous administration, I'm not sure. He said, our policy is don't ask, don't tell. So I don't know if you remember that policy coming up. But I said, okay, well, that's good enough for me for now. But I said, I'll tell you what, when I get this perfected, I'm going to tell everybody because I think it's a great idea. And they said, well, they didn't really. I was small potatoes to them, and I hope I will remain under the radar for some time. So anyway, that's the first challenge. We can't really go on the market in a big way with this because it's not really going to, we run into some snags. Of course, it's not so easy to use in the winter, but guess what? We don't farm in the winter, so it's not really a big problem for us. We run our diesel engines very little in the winter, maybe to plow a little snow and feed some cows as we get going more with our cattle again. So I'm not worried about that. Biodiesel, of course, can be used in the winter. That's one of the advantages of it. The other thing I think we should really set off in a discussion and talk about from the beginning is we can't use this for the cities. We can't, the math isn't there to grow fuel for our cities. This is really a bad idea, I think. We shouldn't be using good crop ground to grow fuel. We should be using it to grow good food of high nutrient density like Dave was talking about in the last hour, because that's what it's for. The economic problems, if you go into business with this, and this has plagued the ethanol industry all the heck. I mean, they get going, and then all of a sudden the price of corn or their supply source skyrockets up through the roof, and then all of a sudden their ethanol price of production and price they have to sell it for is way over what they can sell it for, and they're going out of business. Or on the other side, if the oil companies want to artificially lower the price of their fuel in a region to put out of business the ethanol people, they can certainly do that. Or if the price of oil, the way it's done recently, goes down dramatically and below the cost of production of these biofuels, then they're also in deep trouble economically. So they are really at risk, high risk of profitability when they're dealing with the global fuel markets. And I see that as quite a challenge. But if you have a closed loop community system for farmers that are actually participating in it, and you do it locally so that you're keeping the miles off of this oil, you're not transporting it across the state, even as far as we're doing. If we could sell ours in Great Falls less than 100 miles away, that would be much better than tracing 300 miles to Missoula into Bozeman. But if you can keep the miles off of it, that's where the extra expenses come. And if the farmers become their own supplier and their own customer, then you avoid this problem because you're immune to it. You're sheltered from it. So what will this community scale model look like? This is just an idea that I haven't really implemented yet, but I'm kind of massaging and ready to put out there for anyone who wants to really take over at this level. We're just trying to perfect it on our farm, and then anybody can take it and to the next level, which would be the community level. A farmer-owned closed system co-op. So the farmers would deliver seed to the co-op, and the co-op then would press it, sell it, deliver it, pick up the used oil, clean the used oil, deliver the clean used oil back to the farmers who were the growers and the owners of the co-op. So it's really a closed loop completely. The co-op is protected from the high cost of supply, as I mentioned earlier, because the owners are the suppliers. So they supply their own resource. The co-op is protected from low cost of fuel when that happens because the owners are the customers. So they're their own customers. And it's coming to them at a very, very reduced cost. So it'll always be way lower than the fuel cost, but they don't have to compete out in the marketplace selling it at a big profit or a big profit margin. And then the best part, of course, is the money that the farmers spend on this fuel stays right in the community, circling around and around, because the customers are the suppliers, are the growers are the suppliers, and then your own customer when you use the oil again. So the money that you would be sending to Mobil or to Conoco or whoever going to multinationals stays right local. And I think that's really part of the beauty. And you're supplying the local fry houses all in your community. That's how it would work. So that is the program. And if you have questions, I'll be glad to answer them. I think we have plenty of time for any discussions, and I just want to give you a brief overview. And there's lots of stories in between, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have.
So what's your warm-up and cool-down time on your tractor? You know, how much does it take to refill
the warm-up time actually switches over when you go under load. So by the time you're warmed up and out in the field, and then you put the cultivator in the ground or the seeder or whatever you had, then it will switch. The sensor will switch it over to vegetable at that time. The cool down time that the owners are recommending to us is about an hour, depending on what kind of a load you have too. If you're under a heavy load, it could be less than that. You need about 5 gallons to flush out all the filters and all the lines at the end of the day, so you make sure that diesel is in those lines. And this is one of the problems we were having before. The Elsbed company is in Germany. The instructions we had was all in German. My German is nicht so gut, so I know how to order in the restaurant and ask where the bathroom is, but I don't read technical stuff. And I don't even know if it's in the manual, but in the last visit we had, they showed us how to adjust the adjustment so that we can have the vegetable oil turn on almost at any time, any kind of a load is, no matter how light it is. And it wasn't working for us on seeders and light discs and other implements that weren't pulling very much. So that fixed that problem. But we're very excited about the simplicity of it once it gets up and running. But it's like everything else, you have to have it correctly installed and know what you're doing and make sure that you're watching out for the filters being correct and those kinds of things. So, yes?
So you talked about kind of the philosophy of, could you really be going fuel rather than food, but you said that roughly a third comes out in oil, but that 2/3 that's left over, what percentage of that is protein? What percentage of that is leftover oil that's still, fairly nutritionally?
Oh, okay. So, all right. The question is, how much is left over from the 2/3 that's not going into the oil bucket? So the mash has about around 8 or 9% oil left still in it. Industrial model is very extractive, so they use hexane to extract every last drop of that, and then they take out the hexane, so they tell us, and we can rest assured, of course, that they're telling you absolutely the truth. There's no hexane in our oil. We know that that's a difficult process. So rather than extract every last drop out of your byproducts, and then you really have something that's very little value, we leave it in, which increases the food value of that byproduct for the cattle. So the cattle feed or supplement receiving all that protein. It's about 21% protein. And so it's a very high source of cattle supplement. And they would supplement that in the ration maybe, I don't know, 6 to 8% maybe. And that would be as a supplement to their ration. But in that is going to be a certain amount of oil, and people have told me that the hair in the animals look a lot shinier and better and healthier. The animals are looking better because of the oil, and the other things are getting along with the protein. So by leaving some of the oil in there as a ingredient of the food, of the feed in this case, then we're having that advantage in different areas. That answer your question? Okay, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about harvesting safflower? Are you just cutting off the heads and then that?
Okay, how harvesting safflower? You never, ever, ever want to plug up your combine. Okay, that's the first thing we'd say. It's really not fun to get in there with all the stickers. The other thing, we harvest it just like grain and everything else. We cut it, below the head far enough that we can keep it coming into the header and have something to go through the machine. One thing we found with the safflower is it has lots and lots of little hairs in the ball where the seeds are. And those little hairs come out and they will fill up your filters, your air filters, your air conditioner filters, and they'll plug those up pretty fast. And so you have to watch that. That's about the only really big difference. It thrashes out pretty good. You can tell when it's ready easily by pulling up a couple of plants with your gloves on and whacking them against the tire on your pickup. And when it's ready, the seeds just come right out, and then you know it's ready to harvest. You want to watch the moisture on it. For crushing, the best moisture is around 12%. So you don't want it to go down to 7 or 8. I mean, if it's 100 degrees outside, don't let it go down so dry. And if it's way wetter than that, it won't thrash out as easily. So that kind of takes care of itself.
And then you just leave the threshing on the ground
Yep.
over the winter.
Yep. And the stalks stand up and are pretty good snow catchers. As those little bitty stalks standing. Yeah, okay. Any other questions there? Yes, Bud.
What's it like following safflower with another crop?
Oh, that's a good question. A lot of times with the safflower, we plant companion crops sometimes with that. Like with our green manures, we're doing a lot of alfalfa and clovers. And so we're co-planting alfalfa or clover sometimes with the safflower. So that comes back and gives us a year or 2 or 3 years of no-till actually with the alfalfa, and with the clover we're going 18 months till we turn that down. And it's a pretty heavy feeder. We always follow all of our crops with a green manure crop. If we're not companion planting safflower or clover or alfalfa, we're planting peas or sometimes buckwheat the next year to replenish and to feed the soil. So we very rarely plant a crop right after it. It's a pretty heavy water user with a taproot. It's a very long crop. It's not usually harvested until September.
What a drought year is it?
In drought year it produced less, but it still produced with a taproot. It went down after last year's rainfall. So we still had a crop. It wasn't a barn burner, but it was a decent crop. But next year, well, we've had some snow and rain, but it takes out probably more than its share of water. So we have to, but we replenish those with the green manures, which we don't let grow the whole season anyway. So it's a heavy water feeder, but we don't plant a cash crop after it anyway.
It must be a heavy energy feeder.
Heavy what?
Like it must take a lot of energy out of the soil also. I mean, how it gets that energy. I mean, because that's what it's producing is energy.
Well,
I would think it would be a heavy feeder.
it is a heavy feeder. That's why we go with particularly alfalfa is our biggest soil feeder, and it's there for 3 years. So sometimes we'll follow with that because that's the heaviest one to compensate for that. But we don't always do that. We haven't really seen a lot of problems following crops the second year after we plant the safflower. So, yes?
I know you touched on it a little bit, but can you kind of elaborate on what made you choose kind of such a unique crop such as safflower to use rather than biodiesel? And in the beginning, I mean, was there any risk to you that you know it might not work for your kind of production?
You mean the safflower rather than the other crops?
Yeah.
Well, the one we're looking at first is camelina, because we tried canola before, and we knew that our early heat, and that's actually becoming more of a problem with this climate change. We're getting our heat earlier, and it's hotter sooner, and the rain's stopping sooner. And that's really hard on something like canola, which is its most tender time near the end of June for us. And so The camelina looked like that could be a good possibility, but camelina, as I mentioned, has a lot of omega-3 in it. That's a polyunsaturated fatty acid. That will not work for straight vegetable oil in using straight vegetable oil in diesel engines. You have to have a monounsaturated fatty acid if you're not going to make biodiesel. And I really didn't want to make biodiesel for the reasons I was saying earlier of the quality control of the finished product, the cost of testing for that, and then the byproducts of glycerin and dirty water. Yes.
Do you pay your alfalfa after the second year or something?
Mm-hmm. We get one cutting a year normally, except when like last year when we had twice as much rain, we got twice as many cuttings. So that's what we do. We usually hay at the second year, and that's also the crop we use against our hardest perennial weeds like Canada thistle. And we'll leave, if we have a good stand, we'll leave that in until the Canada thistle disappears before we take that out, and that might take an extra year or so. So, who's Jeff?
So I know that the emissions testing from the EPA was kind of out of the question, but have you got any sort of emissions data from the company in Germany or from another source?
Well, we did a little bit of our own emissions experiments with my Caterpillar mechanic. Came down one time with his emissions gauges. So when you're talking about what the emissions might be, and the safflower was actually, the emission on that was less than diesel. And particularly, I was amazed when you throttle down your diesel engine or the load goes off, the emissions go sky high. Those emissions are really set at a certain load value that they're in the right ranges that are correct. And if you're way off that, if you're idling, it's amazing the emissions going out the stacker is just horrendous. Of course, the idea is you're not idling very much, but that was amazing to me. And of course, we're not idling the safflower oil, so it was hard to compare that range. But at the full load range, the safflower had oil had less emissions than the diesel. What is it? Oh, yes.
What were the facility requirements or regulations for the oil barn?
For the oil production?
Yeah, like the facility, the oil barn itself.
Oh boy. How much time do we have?
We actually do have 20 minutes, but we'll need to have a little wrap-up.
All right. Well, okay. Then I can tell you a little bit about that. So, federal regulations are one of my favorite topics not to talk about. So we had contact with the FDA because now we're in the food and drug thing with the food. And a new guy started in Helena. Is there any FDA guys here? Just checking. Anyway, I'll tell you my experience anyway. So he came up. First of all, he said, well, you need a bathroom. You need toilet facilities. This oil barn business run by my son-in-law, his house is about 100 yards away from the oil barn. And he said, well, we don't have a toilet here. I said, I'm the only employee, and if I need to use the toilet, I just go home. And they said, and then the guy said, well, I'm not sure that doesn't really fit the regulations. And then he said, well, you need at least running water. And he said, well, we don't use water because, as you well know, oil and water don't really mix. And so we wipe everything down. We have everything in the barn had to be, the walls had to be recovered with a food grade covering. We poured new cement on the floor, so everything was brand new and could be wiped down. We painted the floor with some epoxy type paint so it could be wiped clean. And so we wipe and clean up all the oil, and we keep it very, very clean. So you could eat off the floor literally. It's really, my son-in-law does a great job. And then the next thing he said, because he doesn't like any of these answers, so we finally satisfied his water demand by having a portable sink that is run on a 5-gallon jug of water that we can wash our hands. So that solved that pretty much. And then he said, well, you've got to pasteurize your oil. I said, what? I said, you don't pasteurize oil. And he said, well, that's the regulation. You've got to pasteurize it. He said, well, and we fought about this back and forth for 4 or 5 months. And finally, at a food show, I met one of my friends who is a counselor for companies dealing with the FDA. And I said, what in the world do you do with this? I know people don't pasteurize oil. Nothing can grow in oil. Bacteria can't grow in that. And he said, well, here's what you do with the FDA. Just ask them tell them that you'll be glad to follow any regulation that is printed in the reg book, and if he would please send that to us, we'd be glad to read and study that and implement it. And so he sent us the regulation, and the title said, of the paragraph that we were looking at, the title said oils and mayonnaise and salad dressings. And so it was the salad dressings and the mayonnaises that needed to be pasteurized, because they've got eggs and they've got all kinds of stuff, and not the oils. And so we pointed that out to him. He wasn't very happy about that, but that's what the reg said. They said, and they said, well, you've got to, if you can show me from a certified laboratory the certification that your oil is free of bacteria, then I will approve you. And I said, okay, well, where do we send it to have a certification that you're talking about? Oh, he said, I can't tell you that. We're not allowed to recommend any laboratories. And I said, well, I don't know any laboratories. And so they were, the areas where they could be of help, they weren't of help. And the areas where they actually were causing a lot of trouble because of their ignorance mostly, it was a real problem. And there's a fun story. He called up one time. Well, he didn't call up. He came for his surprise inspection because that's part of their routine. But the day he came, nobody was home. I mean, this isn't, you know, $1 million business that's full of employees and running every day. And so nobody was home. So he was the one surprised for the surprise inspection. So then the next week he called up and he said, say, Bob, he said, I'd like to come next Wednesday at 3:30 for my surprise inspection. Will anybody be there? And I said, yes, we'll make sure somebody's here. And so he showed up, and we had our surprise inspection. But those are the kinds of things that we had trouble with. We didn't really have too much trouble except for the toilet facilities, and now we are building something closer. Now we do have some employees as business is growing, and so we're trying to adapt. But it's amazing that any business gets started anymore with all the rules and regulations required to start. Mostly, my experience, I've just started my businesses with a little checking, but not too much, and then I try to just learn as I go, and you're told when you're out of order, and usually if you're working in good faith with these guys, they'll give you a little slack to put things in order, and by that time you can either see if the business is going to be viable and can pay for such a thing or not, and hopefully it's not too unreasonable that you can meet it. So that's been my experience. Yeah.
So the butter that comes out, what's the problem with that? Why isn't that a feed source?
Well, it's you can't really mix it in with the mash too well because it's gooey. It's almost gooey. It's very it's flaky and it has an enormous amount of oil in it because it's just been pressed out. And what we're trying to do is find a special market for it because we think that the texture is much different than the mash, and it doesn't have the same qualities of the mash of the really high protein. It really is high in oil. And we think it would really go well with the cosmetic. It's just trying to find the right combination to help for the butter marketing.
But not an edible.
Well, for animal feed, you mean? Oh, one problem with the other thing that kind of a side note that we're doing is also industrial hemp for the first time. We were growing that, and when you press oil, make oil out of industrial hemp seeds, the cake on that is very tasty, and that is high protein, and we're going to make a high protein powder on that for human consumption. But the cake on the or the mash on the safflower is very bitter, and so it's really not palatable. And even the cows, if a cow has been on cake with molasses, which is often the case, and then you try to give them some of this bitter safflower, they'd really turn their nose up. They don't eat it. But if you start them out on the safflower, they don't really know the difference so much, and they get to eating it much quicker, and you don't really have a problem. But even the cows can tell the difference. It's a little bit bitter, so it's really not palatable, even though it has good nutritional qualities. I saw another, was there another one?
I don't know, I got a major one.
A major one? Uh-oh, okay.
So I'm thinking big, you know, in the community co-op thing and getting the regulations where we can actually use it, possibly even on a highway with diesel trucks or whatever. So couldn't we, after you get the used oil back, blend it with the biodiesel to use to as a fuel.
Mhm.
Now it's a blended fuel and not a legal plant-based fuel that's not regulated by the,
Well,
or okayed by the EPA.
even if you, so the question is, what, can you use it as a blended fuel? But I think if you blend it, you now have a new fuel
Right.
that would have to be approved by EPA.
Yeah.
And you certainly can blend it with straight diesel up to 20% or so without a problem. But I'm thinking, rather than go through all of that, I think that if we would focus on agriculture and have a fuel source for agriculture, in case we do have a big a shortage of fuel sometime, we still have some enough to grow our crops at least some level. Whereas we'll never have enough to run all the traffic and all the trucks on the road.
Well, I'm not worried about them. I'm worried about just with your hub or your co-op owners.
Oh. Well, you see how much you have to run the whole farm. That's really a lot. And I think it would take a while to get up to that level. And so you're thinking about, rather than doing the SVO conversion and on your tractor and whatnot, you do blend?
I'm thinking how you can get it legal for the co-op to be using it.
Well, the co-op is a closed community. It's not going out in the market. If you're not marketing it to the public,
Okay.
you're in a much different regulatory position than when you are marketing to the public. When you're marketing to the public, you're into all kinds of regulations that if you're just doing your own thing, in this country at least, you can do that.
So that's what
Without,
should be considered.
that's kind of under the radar sort of thing, because you're not on the public market, and that's a big difference. In Germany, they don't even allow that, but here we can still do this. So, yes.
Kind of wondering about scalability too in the market to sell all the cooking oil. Aren't universities probably one of the bigger markets already in the state for cooking oil?
The biggest challenge I see with the cooking oil is the franchises. So McDonald's and Burger King and all these that are so tied in to their formulas that I think you'd have to do some pretty good sell jobs to get them to use it. And they're big users. But if you could do it on the economics, not that it costs less to begin with, but it saves more in the end because it lasts longer, then I think they might be interested. And most people say the food tastes better. They can tell the difference in chicken and French fries and all that kind of stuff with the safflower oil compared with what they normally get in restaurants. And also the other thing with the safflower oil, it doesn't transfer the taste as readily as the cheap oils. If you fry a fish and then you fry potatoes right afterwards, you're not going to get a fishy potato taste with the safflower oil the way you do with the cheap oils they're using. So there's a little bit of there'd have to be some marketing there that would be have to be proven, demonstrated. We've done a little of that, but we haven't done. We're now in Missouri doing some side-by-side comparisons and actually trying to put some really good percentages on it. They just gave us this as rough estimates of what they're seeing. It depends what they're frying, for how long they're frying, they think. So they're doing some side-by-side comparisons for us. We'd have to do some research, and then we'd have to do some marketing with it. But I think it has potential, and it's really healthier for you, and it tastes better. So, yes.
What's the shelf life of biodiesel?
The shelf life of the oil?
Storage times.
The safflower oil? The shelf life of safflower oil, it'll go through, it's over a year, but it won't go through 2 summers. So if you are processing that in the fall and going through the winter, and then one summer it'll go through the next winter, so that'd be almost 18 months, but it's at least a year. And sometimes if you're keeping it cool in the basement, in the dark, it'd probably be several years. It doesn't require colored bottles the way some oils do. I mean, like flax oil, it's so unstable. It should always never be in a clear bottle and never at room temperature even. That should be refrigerated all the time because it's so unstable. It's very healthy oil, but it's very unstable. With safflower, it's at the other end of the spectrum. This is the oil you should be used for high temperature cooking. very stable. So we put it in glass bottles because it looks pretty, and you wouldn't want to set it in the sun all summer long, but it's very stable. Yes?
What about like scalability with smaller diesel tractors? Do you think it's cost effective to convert smaller tractors?
Well, yes, it depends how much you're using, of course, because the conversion cost is a couple $1,000 at least for the machinery, or for the kits and whatnot, and then a little bit for extra filters and labor and putting in the lines and that sort of stuff. And there's some maintenance on it. So you don't want to have, depending on your fuel use, you can do your own math to figure out how long it's going to take to repay that. When we're using 1,000 gallons a year, and that's not even all that we're using on that tractor, the payback is quite a bit quicker. Yes?
Have you considered using like some sort of passive heating system to say like heat up your tractor before use rather than using diesel operation to get you up to temp?
Usually with a diesel engine, that's just good maintenance policy. I mean, you start it and you let it warm up before you put a load on it, and that requires more heat than a passive heat would do. I mean, you're still bringing up the temperature to a couple hundred degrees, and so before you're ready to put the load on. So I'm not sure that would be. I'm not really a mechanical guy with all those technical information, but just from what I would guess, I think that would be difficult. Usually passive is a little slower too. Any questions? We're getting probably close to the end.
No, we got a little bit more time.
Okay.
I got a quick question.
Yes. Yes.
You know, the price of commercial diesel, I think would affect the payback
Yes.
time on something like this. So at like today's diesel prices, which are relatively low, I guess, how feasible would it be now to go into this kind of a project for someone to replace their diesel? You know, as opposed to when diesel prices really go up, when the price of petroleum so high, which would be way more attractive.
Sure.
Is it attractive now?
Sure, it's still attractive now. I mean, if we're paying 40 cents a gallon for the handlers, for example, and it's probably no more than 5 or 10 cents for the process to clean it up. So you're getting a diesel equivalent substitute at 50 cents a gallon, for example. And even if it's $2.50, or it's more than that now, but you know, in the round numbers, you're saving $2 a gallon. So in 1,000 gallons, there's your $2,000 that pays most of it in 1 year. If it was twice at today's prices, if it was twice that, then you definitely pay for it in 1 year. I mean, a 1 year payback, it's pretty good, and even if it takes 2 or 3, it's still reasonable. So, I think it's renewable,
It's clean in it.
and it's clean, and it's under control. It's all the things that we believe and talk about in these meetings in this room. Yes.
What's the reason you haven't like fully converted to it?
Well, one reason is we haven't expanded our markets to bring back that much used oil yet. If we can get Bozeman to get us back the used oil, that would more than double what we have available to us immediately. And then we haven't really gone after the McDonald's of the world yet. We really want to know what we're doing quite a bit in more detail and be able to really present a pretty strong case to people like that. But in the end, that would be the idea of these co-ops. There wouldn't just be one. There would be, I would envision there would be many throughout the states. They'd be in each county or each a few counties. So they'd be quite close to each other within, say, 50 miles or something. And then you would market it, hopefully, within that 50-mile or 100-mile radius to the bigger towns. And that's how you could do it. So you wouldn't be putting miles on the oil or the mash or anything. That's the idea. Yes?
What's the problem with MSU giving the oil back?
With MSU?
Yeah.
Because they said it's too hot to put directly into the plastic carboys when they're running to change it. So could they wait for half an hour? I don't know. So the problem is that they've never done it that way before. Have you guys ever run into people that don't want to change something they've done some way over and over and over? They haven't done it that way before, and they see it as a nuisance, an extra nuisance. So we have to show them how Missoula does it, and they make it work just fine. And to help them, and by demonstrating or being there or whatever, showing that it can be done without too much trouble, and then it's a whole missing link of the whole chain for us.